A girl from a small town went out for a walk and disappeared without a trace. Her parents immediately panicked and called the police, but what happened next sparked outrage in their tight-knit community. This mystery remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades, and only recently did detectives uncover the truth in quite an unexpected way. Danielle Houchins was born on November 11, 1980, in Alexandria, Minnesota. Shortly after, her parents had 2 more kids, a boy and a girl. Once their youngest was born, the family decided to move to a small town called Belgrade, Montana. The quiet place was surrounded by mountains and located far from big cities, but it was a popular destination for tourists. A lot of people came there to ski or hike in the mountains, enjoying the picturesque nature. Danielle's parents chose the town mostly because they were offered jobs on the ski patrol. This was perfect for both of them since they loved spending as much time outdoors as possible. Their passion spread to their kids from a very young age, and the family was always up for an adventure. They went skiing, hiking, fishing, and took boat trips on the nearby rivers. Danielle herself got really into climbing, which was easy to get into around there. At the same time, Danielle managed to excel at school. She quickly became one of the top students and had big plans for her future. She dreamed of going to medical school and becoming a bioengineer. On September 21, 1996, their town was hosting its annual festival. People would gather on the streets, listen to music, watch some performances, and just enjoy the day together. Danielle, who was 15 at the time, had plans to meet up with her friends in the evening, but before that, she had a few free hours to kill. Instead of just sitting at home, she decided to go for a walk along the trail located near the river just outside of town. Her mom asked her to be back by 2 p.m. and gave Danielle her wristwatch since she didn't have one of her own. Danielle grabbed a bottle of water and headed out around 11:30, promising to be back on time. But 2 o'clock came and went, and she still hadn't returned. Her mom started to worry, especially since they were expecting guests soon. Thinking Danielle must have just lost track of time, she decided to head to the trail to bring her home. She took a friend with her, and they drove to the parking lot where the trail started. The first thing they noticed was Danielle's white pickup truck. Even though she was only 15 and technically not allowed to drive without an adult, her parents would sometimes let her use the car. It was a small, quiet town with little traffic, and Danielle was already a pretty good driver. Her mom noticed the truck's doors were unlocked, but Danielle was nowhere to be seen. She and her friends started walking along the trail toward the river, but they didn't get far before they spotted Danielle's car keys and her bottle lying on the ground. Her mom became even more worried and started calling out for her, searching the path from the parking lot to the river. When there was still no sign of Danielle, she wasted no time and went straight to the authorities for help. At that point, her mom thought Danielle might have fallen off a slope or gotten injured in some accident. Since the woman didn't have a cell phone, she drove to the police station, and about an hour later, search teams arrived at the trail. The searchers combed through the trail and the surrounding woods, checking the riverbank as well, but they couldn't find any trace of Danielle. As night fell and temperatures dropped close to freezing, the rescuers decided to call off the search until morning. However, Danielle's family refused to go home. They continued searching for her, joined by family, friends, and local residents who broke into groups and spread out to cover more ground. In one of those search groups was a man and his 2 sons, who were friends with Danielle's sister. They headed into the wooded area near the riverbank, using flashlights to guide their way. A few hundred yards from the parking lot, they noticed something strange in the water and went closer to check it out. Shining their lights into the river, they realized it was Danielle's body, lying near the shore in just a few feet of water. The man immediately knew she was dead and ran back to his car to notify the police. On his way to the station, however, he spotted Danielle's father and broke the devastating news to him. The police examined the scene and handed Danielle's body over to medical experts, who needed a few days to conduct a proper examination and determine the cause of death. But despite this, the sheriff quickly announced that it appeared to be an accident. There were no visible wounds or signs of foul play, so the police initially believed Danielle may have just accidentally fallen into the river and drowned. Danielle's family, devastated by the news of her death, couldn't believe it. From a young age, she had spent a lot of time outdoors, was very familiar with nature and knew that trail along the river well. Her parents also couldn't understand how she could have drowned in such shallow water. Still, the sheriff stuck to his version and didn't launch a proper investigation. But everything changed when the medical examiners released their report. They discovered that Danielle had numerous scratches and bruises, which looked like defensive wounds. It appeared she had fought back against someone. They also noted that her underwear had been pulled down. The experts found it hard to imagine how this could have happened in the course of an accident. Moreover, they established that Danielle had been sexually assaulted and found a biological sample from an unknown male on her underwear. As for the cause of death, the examiners agreed that she had been drowned, but it seemed that someone had held her underwater. They also noticed that Danielle's watch, which should have been on her wrist, was found up near her elbow. The experts suggested that the killer might have dragged her by the arms, causing the watch to slip down as he pulled her toward the river. Despite all these findings, the medical examiners for some reason still listed the manner of death as undetermined. While they were sure Danielle had drowned, they couldn't find enough solid evidence to conclusively prove it was an intentional murder. Because of this, the police didn't launch a full investigation, maintaining that they were still uncertain about what really happened to Danielle. Even so, they did try to gather more details. When forensic experts examined Danielle's clothes, they found 4 hairs on her underwear, which also belonged to an unknown male. They believe these were arm hairs and managed to extract a partial DNA sample. However, the FBI didn't yet have a national DNA database. The only thing the experts could confirm was that the hairs and the semen found on Danielle's underwear came from the same person. The police also re-examined the area where Danielle's body was found and discovered a man's boot print in the dirt, although they weren't able to determine if it was connected to the case. Investigators questioned several potential suspects they thought might be involved, but couldn't link any of them to the crime. The problem was that the DNA sample they had was only partial, so they couldn't even compare it to the suspect's DNA. It's worth mentioning that many details of this case were kept secret, not only from the public, but also from Danielle's own family. For a long time, they didn't even know that she had been sexually assaulted. From their perspective, it seemed like the police genuinely didn't have any idea what happened to Danielle and were still trying to figure it out. Despite the sheriff's position, some police officers were puzzled that the case hadn't been reclassified as a homicide and investigated accordingly. One of them was Cindy Botek, who had joined the police just a few days before Danielle's death. She's been involved in the investigation and, from the very beginning, was convinced they were dealing with a murder. However, back then she didn't have the authority to go against her superiors and launch a full-scale investigation, so all she could do was wonder what had really happened that day. One of the theories was that the killer might have known Danielle, like a neighbor or a friend. Botek spoke with her parents, but they couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm their daughter. She had never had any problems with her classmates or anyone else in town. For months after Danielle's death, there was almost no progress in the case. The police continued to interview people and consider various suspects, but because of the sheriff's reluctance to start a proper investigation, they couldn't do much. Some officers, including Botek, were baffled that the case hadn't been reclassified as a homicide and that no one was actively searching for the killer. To them, it was obvious that Danielle had been attacked, and the person responsible could still be living in their community. A few years after the murder, the police tried entering the partial DNA sample found on Danielle's body into the FBI database, but no matches were found. In the years following Danielle's death, her family learned more details about the case, including the fact that she had been sexually assaulted. They were outraged that the sheriff hadn't treated it as a homicide from the start and had kept such critical information from them. The sheriff later claimed he had never considered the case an accident and had always believed it was a murder. This contradicted his earlier statements to local newspapers, where he had clearly said there wasn't enough evidence to label it a homicide. Danielle's parents also remembered him telling them the same thing, which only fueled their frustration and confusion. The sheriff then tried to shift the focus onto the medical examiners, insisting that the only reason he didn't launch a full investigation was because they had listed the manner of death as undetermined. But Danielle's family believed the sheriff was just trying to avoid responsibility. Everyone understood that a proper investigation in the first few days after the murder could have helped solve the case and catch the killer, but little effort was made. Now, many years later, finding the murderer had become far more difficult, with the trail gone cold. Danielle's parents continued to fight for a fair investigation, but each attempt led to a dead end. Eventually, her younger sister took up the case, giving interviews to local media, reaching out to investigators, and doing everything in her power to ensure that one day Danielle's killer would be found. In 2019, 23 years after the murder, Danielle's family finally managed to get the investigation reopened. Unfortunately, this didn't lead to any real breakthroughs. The FBI's DNA database still didn't show any matches, and re-examining old suspects went nowhere, leaving the case stalled once again. This continued until 2021, when a new sheriff took over the local police department. He had joined the force just days before Danielle's death, and her case had haunted him ever since. Like some of his colleagues, he had always believed it was a murder, and now he had the authority to launch a full investigation. But after so many years, he had almost no solid leads, except for the partial DNA sample from the possible perpetrator. The sheriff realized the case needed a fresh perspective, so he brought in two outside experts. One was a former investigator from California who now worked as a private detective, and the other was a DNA specialist. Together, they focused on identifying the owner of the hair and the biological material found on Danielle's underwear. First, they sent the samples to a lab in California, which had some of the most advanced DNA analysis tools, and then they waited. Around the same time, in August 2023, Danielle's case was officially reclassified as a homicide, nearly 27 years after her death. A few months later, in early 2024, experts from the lab contacted the investigators, saying they hadn't gotten closer to identifying the owner of the DNA. Although they had managed to do something important, their tools allowed them to extract a full DNA profile, which was still a significant step forward. The investigators then sent these samples to another lab in Virginia, hoping they could use genetic genealogy to trace the DNA back to its owner. Several months passed before they finally got the call they were waiting for. The experts at the Virginia lab explained that they had uploaded the perpetrator's DNA profile to public genetic databases, where people voluntarily share their DNA to find relatives. These databases have helped solve many cases using genetic genealogy, tracing suspects through their family trees. But this time, things took an unexpected turn. To the experts' surprise, they immediately got a perfect match. It turned out that the owner of the DNA had willingly submitted his sample to the database, something that doesn't happen often. The man was 55-year-old Paul Hutchinson, who lived in a small town called Dillon, about 100 miles from where Danielle was killed. Investigators discovered that at the time of the murder, Hutchinson was 27 and a student at the University of Montana, just 12 miles from Belgrade. He had a degree in biology and worked for Montana's Bureau of Land Management. Paul was also married with 2 children. What stood out even more was that he had no criminal record, not even the slightest offense. Now that the police had identified their suspect, they needed to obtain a direct DNA sample from him. On July 23rd, they went to his workplace to talk to him. As they pulled up to the Bureau building, they saw Paul standing outside with his coworkers. The investigators told him they wanted to ask him a few questions at the station, and according to them, they could see the color drain from his face. Still, Paul agreed to go in for questioning. The detectives took their time, starting by asking about other unsolved cases in the area. Paul remained fairly calm at first, but everything changed when they showed him a photo of Danielle. He suddenly became extremely nervous, sweating, scratching his face, and even chewing on his hands. He could barely stand up and even stumbled over a chair when trying to get up. To the police, his reaction was almost a confirmation of guilt. However, Paul continued to deny any involvement in the murder, but his confession wasn't necessary. Detectives collected his DNA sample and sent it to the lab. For now, they let him go, since they didn't have enough evidence to charge him with the murder until the lab results came back. Right after the interrogation, the detectives contacted Danielle's sister and told her that they had finally found her sister's killer. They added that the police had no doubt about his guilt and that the DNA analysis would only confirm it. Danielle's sister, who had been waiting nearly 28 years for this moment, felt relieved knowing the person responsible would finally face justice. She was also aware that they still had to go through a long court process to bring this case to a close. But things took an unexpected turn. The day after the interrogation, when the police were supposed to receive the DNA results from the lab, Paul called his local police station, saying he needed help. He gave the operator his location and then hung up. When officers arrived at the scene, they found Paul's car parked on the side of the road. Inside, they found him, dead, with a gun lying beside him. During the investigation, detectives concluded that Paul did it himself. There was no note in the car, but his motive seemed clear. He likely realized there was no way to avoid prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. For his wife and children, the entire situation was a complete shock. None of them knew what Paul had done nearly 30 years ago, and they weren't even aware that he had been questioned by the police. His family learned about these accusations at the same time they found out about his death. Paul's friends and coworkers were just as stunned when the truth came out. They all saw him as a devoted family man and a reliable friend. Despite the shock to those who knew him, detectives had no doubt that Paul was responsible for Danielle's murder. In August 2024, they held a press conference where they announced that his DNA was a perfect match with the samples found on the victim's underwear. Police believed this was a crime of opportunity. There was no evidence that Danielle knew Paul. It's likely she crossed paths with him near the trail, and he made the decision to assault her, killing her afterward to ensure she wouldn't identify him. Danielle's family admitted that hearing about Paul's death brought them more relief than frustration, even though he would not face a lifetime in prison. What angered them most was the thought that he could have been caught decades earlier if the local sheriff had taken the case more seriously. If that had happened, Paul wouldn't have been able to live nearly 30 years of freedom, start a family, and enjoy a peaceful life. Paul's wife also expressed her condolences to Danielle's family, stating that she in no way supported or excused what he had done. Morgan Nick was born on September 12, 1988, in the small town of Ozark, Arkansas. Shortly after her birth, her parents welcomed a son, and a year later, another daughter. Morgan had a wonderful relationship with her younger siblings. They could spend hours playing together, and the little ones admired her in every way. When she was just starting to learn how to read, Morgan would practice with children's books, reading bedtime stories to her brother. She was also an animal lover from a young age, and would often tell her parents that she wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. In elementary school, Morgan joined the Girl Scouts, where she had fun making crafts, going on nature trips, and just enjoying time with the other girls. When Morgan was 6, her parents decided to get a divorce, but the kids still got to spend lots of time with their dad. In early summer of 1995, a family friend invited Morgan's mom to a Little League baseball game in a nearby town called Alma. At first, she thought about declining. After all, it was a Friday evening, and the stadium was nearly 30 miles away. But in the end, she decided to go and take Morgan along, figuring it might be a fun way to spend time together. On the evening of June 9th, Morgan's mom left the younger kids with their grandmother and headed to the stadium. Although it was a small venue, about 300 people had shown up for the game, including parents and other kids. She found her friends, and they settled in to watch the game. But it didn't take long for Morgan to get bored. After a while, she noticed 2 kids she knew, and they invited her to come play and catch fireflies near the stadium. At first, her mom was hesitant to let her go. It was already getting dark, and they were visiting the town for the first time, so she was worried that something could happen to her. But her friends reassured her that their kids played near the stadium all the time, and there was nothing to worry about. Reluctantly, she let Morgan go, and the girl ran off with the other kids. They stopped by a small hill, still within her mom's sight, and she kept an eye on Morgan every now and then. About 15 minutes later, the baseball game ended, and the players started heading toward the bleachers to meet their parents. Morgan's mom looked away for just a few seconds, but when she glanced back, her daughter was already gone. The 2 kids she'd been playing with were walking towards the bleachers, and Morgan wasn't with them. The woman approached the kids and asked if they had seen her daughter, They explained that before heading back to the stadium, they had stopped to shake the sand out of their shoes after playing. They went over to a car in the parking lot, leaned on it, and emptied their shoes, with Morgan standing behind the car while they were at the front. Once they were done, they started walking back to the stadium, but Morgan was nowhere to be seen. Her friends assumed she had just stayed near the car to wait for her mom, so they didn't think much of it and went on their way. Morgan's mom looked toward the parking lot and spotted her car, but there was no sign of Morgan. She rushed over and checked inside, but her daughter was nowhere to be found. Panic began to set in, and she returned to the kids, hoping they could shed some light on Morgan's disappearance. She asked them where her daughter could have gone, but they had no idea. Although they did mention that they had seen a man in the parking lot while they were playing. He was standing near a red pickup truck, watching the stadium and occasionally glancing their way. At one point, he even approached them and said something, but they couldn't recall his exact words. They only remembered that he spoke with some kind of a country accent. Thinking that this man might have had something to do with her daughter's disappearance, Morgan's mom immediately called the police. 6 minutes later, officers arrived at the stadium and first spoke to the kids who had been with Morgan before she vanished. During their conversation, the police were able to get more details about the man near the stadium. Piecing together the children's accounts, the investigators concluded that he was a white man between 23 and 30 years old, around 6 feet tall, with an average build, a beard, a mustache, and dark hair. The kids also remembered his vehicle quite well. It was an old red pickup truck with Arkansas plates and a white camper shell on the back. This detail struck the officers as suspicious because a camper shell could easily fit an adult, let alone a child. Another odd thing was that the camper seemed unusually short for the truck, making it look out of place for that model. This raised further suspicion that the man might be directly involved in Morgan's disappearance and could have used the camper to abduct her. The kids also mentioned that the man was wearing only jeans and had no shirt on. The officers immediately searched the parking lot, but they couldn't find any vehicle matching the description. After speaking with the kids, they began questioning everyone who was still at the stadium. However, all of the 300 attendees had been focused on the game, and none of them recalled seeing anything strange or suspicious that evening. A search around the stadium also came up empty, so the officers expanded their efforts to the nearby streets. Despite their best efforts, no trace of Morgan was found that night. Her mother was devastated. She refused to go home and ended up spending the rest of the night at the fire station. The next day, the search intensified as news of Morgan's disappearance spread quickly throughout the area, prompting dozens of volunteers to come forward. Soon, the FBI and state police joined the efforts, providing helicopters for aerial searches and creating a suspect sketch based on Morgan's friends' descriptions. The sketch, along with photos of Morgan, was distributed across the town and nearby communities in the hopes that someone would recognize the man. Initially, the authorities also thought that Morgan might have simply wandered off from the parking lot and gotten lost. But as nearly 24 hours passed without any sign of her, it became clear that if that were the case, she would have been found by then. That evening, police also began receiving alarming reports from parents who shared some disturbing stories. One woman told them that just a few hours before the baseball game, a stranger had tried to lure her 4-year-old daughter into his red pickup truck. It happened near a laundromat in Alma while the woman was inside, and her daughter was standing near the building. When the mother came out, the man drove off. She provided a description of the suspect, which matched the sketch of Morgan's possible abductor. The day after Morgan's disappearance, another report came in from a witness in Fort Smith, a town not far from Alma. He saw a man trying to lure a 9-year-old girl into a public restroom, but the girl managed to get away. Once again, the man's description matched the composite sketch based on the accounts from Morgan's friends. All of this pointed to the possibility that the person behind Morgan's disappearance might have previously attempted to abduct other victims or even successfully committed similar crimes in the past. The police focused on locating the red pickup truck matching the witness's description and began checking the backgrounds of known offenders in nearby towns. Over the next few weeks, investigators received hundreds of tips about potential suspects, but they either couldn't establish a connection or confirm that the individuals had no involvement in the crime. Meanwhile, investigators continued to comb the area around the stadium, collecting various items that could potentially be considered as evidence. They found several cigarette butts, bottles, and other objects, which were sent to the lab for DNA analysis. But in the end, the police had no clear indication whether any of these items were actually connected to Morgan's disappearance. As for the red pickup truck, the police received nearly 250 calls from witnesses across various towns and even neighboring states, all reporting sightings of similar vehicles. The problem was that a lot of residents drove similar models, and there were literally thousands of them. Investigators tried to check each owner, but once again, they found no evidence linking any of them to Morgan's disappearance. This continued for 2 weeks until the police received a surprising call. A resident of a town called Stuttgart, about a 3-hour drive from Alma, was on his property when he noticed a man trying to break into his car. The homeowner scared him off, and the intruder immediately fled. When he was running away, the witness saw that the man was holding a little girl by the hand. The police showed him the composite sketch of the suspect, and he confirmed that the person trying to get into his car looked very similar to the suspect, and the girl resembled Morgan. Investigators quickly launched a large-scale operation in Stuttgart, securing an area of about 10 square miles and deploying several dozen officers. Morgan's parents immediately headed to the town, hoping their daughter would be finally found. Hundreds of volunteers, along with the police, began searching the entire town and surrounding area. Helicopters scanned from above, and search dogs tried to pick up Morgan's scent using her belongings. The search continued for 16 hours, but they found no trace of the missing girl. Eventually, the police began to doubt the witness's story. They conducted 2 polygraph tests, both of which suggested he was lying. Although the man insisted he was telling the truth, he eventually admitted that he had made up the entire story. He did see someone trying to break into his car, but he hadn't gotten a good look at the person's face, and there was no little girl with him. The man was arrested for providing false information, which cost nearly a full day of search efforts and thousands of dollars. It's unclear if he faced any punishment, but such actions typically result in a serious fine or a jail sentence. Investigators found themselves back at square one, but giving up wasn't an option. They brought in 17 more officers from across the state, and the team focused on sorting through the leads that kept coming in. By then, they had over 1,500 tips, but none of them brought detectives any closer to finding Morgan. Her parents didn't give up either, but as the months went by, their hopes started to fade. About a year after Morgan disappeared, her mom found a nonprofit dedicated to finding missing children. Although she was still focused on searching for her daughter, there weren't any new clues left to follow. That's when she began helping other families who were going through similar tragedies, and she put her efforts into raising awareness about the dangers that could strike at any moment in a child's life. Over the next several years, police kept following up on various leads and questioning potential suspects, but nothing seemed to bring any progress. In 2001, 6 years after Morgan's disappearance, the FBI released an age-progressed image showing what she might look like. That same year, several well-known TV shows aired segments about her case, which led to an increase in the number of tips. Although most of these tips turned out to be dead ends, one in particular caught the investigators' attention. The caller claimed that the girl's body was buried on a property in Boonville, a small town about an hour from Alma. The police took this tip seriously because the person provided specific details about the case that had never been made public. In early 2002, they obtained a search warrant for the property. Bringing search dogs along, they dug up the entire area, but no trace of Morgan was found. Since then, the case remained cold for nearly a decade. In 2010, police received another tip about a possible location where Morgan's abductor might have held her, this time in another state. They conducted a search, but once again, there was no evidence to suggest the girl had ever been there. Interestingly, in 2017, police returned to search the same house, but this time for a different investigation. It turned out that a man who had once lived there was in prison for crimes against minors, and authorities suspected him in another similar case. But even then, the search turned up no new clues. In 2019, a new documentary about the case was released. For the first time since Morgan's disappearance, police shared a photo of the red pickup truck believed to be connected to the abductor. The vehicle had been briefly captured on someone's camera during the game, but the poor quality and angle made it nearly impossible to make out any important details. Following the documentary's release, police reached out to the public, asking for any information about who might have owned the truck. They received a series of new tips, but despite these efforts, they still couldn't make any progress in solving the case. This continued until 2021, when investigators finally named their main suspect in the case. The man was Billy Lynx, who had come to the police's attention in the early weeks of Morgan's disappearance. Lynx had a criminal record for offenses against minors, and he owned a similar red pickup truck. However, in 1995, police could not establish any connection between him and Morgan's disappearance, even after searching his truck. During his questioning, they felt that Billy was being honest about his innocence. He was also significantly older than 30, while detectives relied on Morgan's friends' accounts that described the abductor as being younger. Now, nearly 30 years later, detectives began to look at him again. This time, they hoped that modern DNA analysis tools could uncover any traces of Morgan's presence in his vehicle. But there were some issues. Billy had passed away in 2000 while serving time for an attempted abduction. Just 2 months after Morgan's disappearance, he tried to lure another girl into his car while she was standing outside a store. Her mother scared him off and reported the incident to the police, leading to his arrest. At that time, he was 70 years old, and he died of natural causes 5 years later while still in prison. Another complication was that police had no idea where Billy's pickup truck was, or if it even still existed after nearly 3 decades. The investigators focused on tracking down the pickup truck, and after some time, they managed to trace its chain of ownership since Billy's arrest. To the surprise of the detectives, they actually found the truck. It was still running, and the current owner agreed to let the police examine it. Initially, the detectives didn't get their hopes up too high, since any DNA evidence could have easily been erased or degraded over the years. But surprisingly, forensic experts found a few hairs in the truck bed that seemed to match Morgan's hair. The samples were sent to a Texas lab, equipped with the latest DNA analysis technology, for a closer look. It took 8 months, but finally, there was a breakthrough. They managed to extract a DNA sample from the hair and compared it to Morgan's mother's DNA. The results indicated a close genetic match in the first degree of relation. In other words, the hair likely belonged to one of her children or siblings. Morgan's mother stated that she had never heard of Billy Lynx and had never met him in her life. Detectives also knew that no one else from Morgan's immediate family could have been in that truck, which meant that the little girl herself must have been there. On October 1st, 2024, the police held a press conference to announce that Billy Lynx was now officially considered responsible for Morgan's abduction, and they had no doubt about his involvement. Unfortunately, no one believes that Morgan could still be alive nearly 29 years after her disappearance. Investigators suspect that Billy killed her in the first few days after the abduction, but where he hid her remains is still unknown. Even though the case is considered essentially solved, the police have declared that they will continue searching for her remains. Still, without a confession from Billy, this task seems nearly impossible. Detectives are also going to look into Billy's possible involvement in other cases. Considering that he had attempted at least a few kidnappings shortly after Morgan's disappearance, the police suspect that there could be many more crimes in his past. At the time of Morgan's abduction, he was already 70 years old, and it seems likely that he had a long history of such offenses. Plus, he had served in the military during World War II, giving him certain skills that may have been used in his crimes. It's worth noting that Morgan's disappearance became one of the most well-known crimes in all of Arkansas. Authorities even decided to rename the Amber Alert system to Morgan Alert in her memory. As for her mother, she continues to help other children and families through her nonprofit organization. This work has been her way of coping with the loss of her daughter, though deep down, she still holds on to a small hope that Morgan might somehow be alive. Ellie Gould was born on February 6, 2002, in the small British town of Calne. She came from a big, close-knit family. Besides her parents and older brother, she had a lot of relatives living nearby, and they were all very close. From a young age, Ellie had a deep love for animals, especially horses. Her parents would often take her to the stables, and eventually, they decided to get her a pony. Ellie got into horseback riding, started participating in various events, and achieved some pretty impressive results. Besides that, she planned to study psychology after high school and joined the mounted police. By early 2019, at the age of 17, Ellie was finishing her last year of school. She had plenty of friends there because she always tried to get along with everyone and avoid any conflicts. That same year, a classmate asked Ellie out, and they quickly started dating. Ellie, who had never been in a relationship before, was excited about this new experience. On May 3rd, Ellie woke up early as usual and started getting ready for school. She didn't have any morning classes that day, so she only needed to be at school by noon for just a few lessons. She had arranged for a friend to pick her up, said goodbye to her parents as they left for work, and waited at home. A few hours later, Ellie texted her friend, letting her know she decided to skip school that day and stay home, telling her not to come by. Her friend figured Ellie just didn't feel like going in for a couple of classes and headed off without her. Around 3 p.m., Ellie's father came home from work. When he walked into the kitchen, he was met with a horrifying sight. His daughter was lying face down on the floor in a large pool of blood. At first, he thought Ellie might have fallen and hit her head or gotten into some other accident. But then he saw the blood splattered all over the kitchen and noticed a knife lodged in his daughter's neck, with her hands gripping the handle. He immediately called an ambulance and tried to perform first aid, following the operator's instructions. But Ellie showed no signs of life, and her father realized she was already gone. When the paramedics arrived, all they could do was confirm Ellie's death, estimating she had been dead for at least 4 hours. They also saw multiple stab wounds on her body, most of them concentrated in her neck area. Ellie's parents were in complete disbelief. Even when the police told them that their daughter had been murdered, her father struggled to accept it. He was in a deep state of shock, convinced that what had happened to Ellie was just some kind of terrible accident. Her body was handed over to the medical examiners, and they established more details about what had happened. Along with the 13 stab wounds, they discovered signs of strangulation on her neck. It seemed the attacker had failed to kill her that way, so he grabbed the kitchen knife. They also found several defensive wounds, showing that Ellie had fought back, desperately trying to defend herself from the attacker. While forensic experts examined the crime scene, the police began their investigation. They brought Ellie's parents to the station and asked if they knew anyone who might have wanted to harm their daughter. After looking at each other, both parents could only think of one name: Thomas, Ellie's boyfriend. Her mom explained that Ellie and Thomas had started dating just a few months earlier, and at first, Ellie was thrilled. She had never been in a relationship before, and Thomas seemed like a great guy. He was a top student, played sports, and was part of the school's rugby team. But things between them started to go downhill pretty quickly. Thomas wanted to spend almost all of his time with her, and he became more demanding about it as the days went by. Ellie, on the other hand, couldn't give him that much attention. She needed to focus on her final exams and take care of her ponies. As time went on, Thomas's behavior got only worse. He would get upset with her, accusing her of not wanting to spend time together, and became increasingly controlling. He would call and text her constantly throughout the day, and then get angry when she couldn't respond right away. Ellie's parents had always felt that Thomas wasn't the right match for her. When he visited their home, he would mostly stay quiet, which they found odd. Ellie, on the other hand, was very outgoing, and her parents figured the relationship wouldn't last long. And they were right. Just a few months into the relationship, Ellie started thinking about breaking up with him. Not only was Thomas's behavior making her more and more uncomfortable, but she also realized that she needed to focus on her exams and getting into college. In the end, she decided to end things and broke up with him on May 2nd, just one day before she was killed. The police also spoke with Ellie's friends, who shared more details about the breakup. Ellie had told them that Thomas didn't take it well. He kept trying to convince her to stay together, calling her constantly and asking to meet, but Ellie refused to talk about it. Their mutual friends mentioned that Thomas's behavior changed drastically after the breakup. That same day, he posted on social media saying that the past few days had been incredibly hard for him. Not only had he just broken up with Ellie, but his father had been diagnosed with cancer, and his aunt had recently passed away. Thomas ended the post by saying he was struggling to cope and planned to seek help from the school counselor. After seeing the post, some of Thomas's friends reached out to offer their support. When they spoke with him, they noticed he seemed genuinely depressed. But when the police asked if they thought Thomas could have harmed Ellie, his friends couldn't believe it and insisted that it was impossible. With all this information in hand, the investigators decided to talk to Thomas. But before that, they examined Ellie's phone and discovered that Thomas had messaged her that morning, asking to meet. They went to Thomas's house and asked where he had been that morning. Thomas explained that his mom had driven him to school, but he was too upset over the breakup and his other problems to attend classes. So, instead of going in, he waited until his mom left, walked to the bus stop, and headed back home. On the way, he messaged one of his teachers to let them know he wouldn't be at school today. According to Thomas, he didn't leave the house after that. He spent the rest of the day doing homework and relaxing. During the conversation, he also asked if Ellie was okay, and the officers told him about her death. After speaking with Thomas, the investigators went to talk to his mother, and here they encountered an interesting twist. She confirmed that she had dropped him off at school that morning, but when she returned home later, Thomas wasn't there. The police returned to talk to him again. He explained that he hadn't wanted his mom to know he skipped the entire day of school, so he hid in the closet and waited until she left for work. During the conversation, the officers noticed fresh scratches on Thomas's face. When asked how he got them, Thomas claimed he did it himself, but the investigators were skeptical. Given that the medical examiners concluded Ellie had fought back during the attack, these injuries could have easily been inflicted during the struggle. The police also questioned all of Ellie's neighbors, and one of them shared an interesting observation. That morning, they had seen a man approaching Ellie's house. However, due to the distance, the neighbor couldn't make out the man's face or any other useful features. They could only provide a rough description of what he was wearing. The police decided to check Thomas's alibi by looking at the GPS data from his phone. They confirmed that he returned home after leaving school, but what they discovered next sharply contradicted his story. At 10:50 a.m., Thomas's phone disconnected from his home Wi-Fi and began moving in the direction of Ellie's house. Just 3 minutes later, his phone was located near her home, where it remained for about an hour. At 11:51 a.m., the phone started heading back towards Thomas's house and reconnected to his home Wi-Fi within minutes. The police realized that it would have been impossible for Thomas to cover the distance between his and Ellie's home on foot in just 3 minutes, since he lived in a neighboring village several miles away. Then, they reviewed surveillance footage along the route and spotted a silver Ford Focus, which belonged to Thomas's parents. The movement of the car matched the phone's location data, leading investigators to conclude that Thomas must have been driving it. The camera also captured the same car leaving Thomas's house again and returning just 18 minutes later. The investigators couldn't find any footage that showed exactly where Thomas had gone during that short trip. However, they managed to narrow down the general area where he might have stopped. Since it seemed like Thomas had only been there for about a minute, the police suspected he might have been getting rid of evidence. Their hunch soon proved correct. While searching a small wooded area, officers found a trash bag containing blood-stained rags and an apron. With all this evidence, the police obtained a warrant to search Thomas's home. They asked him to provide the clothes he had been wearing that morning, and Thomas said he had put them in the washing machine. The officers seized the clothing, along with his shoes, and sent everything to the lab. forensic experts quickly conducted the analysis and found traces of blood on nearly all of his clothes. Although Thomas had tried to wash them, the experts were able to extract a DNA sample from the blood. The analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Ellie, just like the blood found on the rags in the woods. Thomas's clothes also matched the description given by Ellie's neighbor, who had seen a man near her house that morning. All of this, combined with other evidence, painted a pretty clear picture of what had likely happened that day. According to the investigators' version, Thomas had planned the murder from the start. After his mom dropped him off at school, he immediately took a bus back home, hid in the closet, and waited for her to leave. He then drove the family car to Ellie's house. It seems that Ellie let him in, possibly thinking he just wanted to talk, and they ended up in the kitchen. Based on the medical examiner's report, Thomas tried to strangle Ellie, which is when he got the scratches on his face. When he couldn't kill her that way, he grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed her 13 times. For the next hour, Thomas tried to clean up the crime scene, using the rags and leaving smudges all over the kitchen. He then gathered the rags into a trash bag and tried washing his sneakers in the sink, where traces of blood were also found. After that, he wiped the knife with a kitchen apron, likely to erase his fingerprints, and tossed the apron into the bag. Then, he placed the knife in Ellie's hand and positioned it around her neck, seemingly hoping the police would think she had done it herself and wouldn't suspect him. Detectives also recalled the message Ellie had sent to her friend, saying she wasn't going to school and asking not to pick her up. They concluded this message was sent after she had already died. It seems Thomas had taken her iPhone, unlocked it using Ellie's fingerprint, and sent the message himself. Apparently, he didn't want the body to be found so soon. But that wasn't the end of Thomas's attempts to cover his tracks. After throwing his clothes in the washing machine at home and dumping the bag of evidence in the woods, he ran into a neighbor and asked for a ride to school. There, he attended the remaining classes, chatted with his friends, and even stopped by the school nurse. He told her how difficult the last few days had been for him and how he was struggling to cope. The nurse, concerned about his emotional state, called his mother, who then took him home. Later that day, Thomas posted on social media about his breakup with Ellie and the other problems he'd been dealing with. At the time, Ellie's body hadn't been discovered yet, and police believed that all of these actions were part of his attempt to create an alibi. It took the police only a few hours to gather all these evidence, and by the same evening, the 17-year-old was arrested on suspicion of murder. During the interrogation, Thomas continued to deny any involvement, and the case was eventually sent to court. The first hearing took place on August 29th, 4 months after the murder. This time, Thomas suddenly changed his story. He stood before the judge and confessed to killing Ellie, though there was a catch. According to his new version, he had gone to Ellie's house that morning to study for their exams. During their study session, an argument broke out, and from that point on, he claimed he could hardly remember anything. He recalled trying to strangle her, but said the rest of his actions were a complete blur. The prosecution didn't buy Thomas's new story, pointing out several major inconsistencies. First of all, Ellie didn't want to have anything to do with him anymore, and all her friends and family knew this. So, the idea that they were studying together seemed highly unlikely, especially since her friend was supposed to pick her up soon. Thomas's claim of memory loss also didn't add up with the fact that he spent an hour trying to clean up the crime scene. On top of that, he placed the murder weapon in Ellie's hand, as if trying to make it look like she did it herself. After that, he went on to get rid of the evidence, create an alibi at school, and even tried to wash all of his clothes. Given all of this, the court sided with the prosecution, and in November 2019, Thomas was found guilty of murder. Before the sentencing, he gave a final statement, apologizing to Ellie's family and expressing genuine regret for his actions. However, there was another issue at the end of the trial. Thomas was only 17 at the time of the murder, which directly impacted his sentence. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in just 12 years. He also added an additional 5 years for the brutality of the crime. This means Thomas could potentially be released at 34 years old. This verdict sparked outrage not only from the victim's family, but also among many citizens across the country. People were baffled as to how someone who committed premeditated murder could receive such a short sentence. But despite the public outcry, there was nothing anyone could do to change the court's decision. Ellie's father stated that this sentence puts other women at risk, as Thomas could become a danger to society upon release. He believes that Thomas is a psychopath who should not be let out of prison for the rest of his life. This injustice prompted Ellie's parents to dedicate the next few years to changing the existing legislation. In 2021, they finally achieved progress. The authorities passed Ellie's Law, which allows juvenile murderers to receive prison sentences of up to 27 years without parole. Unfortunately, this change will not affect Thomas, as he was convicted under the old laws. The only thing Ellie's parents managed to secure was a requirement for Thomas to undergo extensive therapy after his release, in hopes that it would prevent him from committing similar crimes in the future. Since then, Ellie's parents have been organizing events in memory of their daughter, inviting children to ride her horses. According to her mother, this activity helps ease the pain of their loss, as horseback riding was Ellie's greatest passion. Janelle Patton was born on June 30th, 1972, in Sydney, Australia. She was an only child, and her parents lavished all their love and attention on her. From a very young age, Janelle developed a passion for music. She played both the piano and clarinet and was active in her school's music group. After finishing high school, Janelle went to university to study medicine, but after just a year, she decided to drop out and focus on her career. She got a job at a bank and spent the next few years working her way up. Over time, though, Janelle started feeling that big city life, with all of its challenges and stresses, was taking a toll on her, and she began thinking about moving somewhere quieter. In October 1999, at 27 years old, Janelle decided to move to a small island called Norfolk. The island was nearly 1,000 miles from Australia. Back then, Norfolk had its own custom regulations and local laws, making it pretty independent from the mainland, but it was still considered part of the country. With a population of around 2,000, everyone in Norfolk knew each other, and because it was so isolated, new faces were rare except for tourists. The island was a popular spot for visitors from both Australia and New Zealand, which was a bit closer. Janelle quickly found a job at a local hotel, got to know the island's residents, and eventually settled into their laid-back way of life. Norfolk felt like a small town, but with the added isolation of being surrounded by nothing but ocean for hundreds of miles. Because of that, locals really tried to get along. After all, they didn't have much choice. In late March 2002, a year and a half after moving, Janelle's parents decided to visit her for the first time, and she was really excited. They arrived on March 30th, and Janelle spent the whole day showing them around, introducing them to the island's main sites and the locals. The next day, Janelle had a morning shift at the hotel, so they planned to meet up as soon as she finished work. She had rented a small cottage on the property of a local woman, but it wasn't big enough to fit her parents. So she booked them a room at a hotel. That morning, Janelle finished her shift around 11 a.m. and set off on her daily walk, something she did regularly. Her route was a short loop from her house to a lookout point at the edge of the island. Her parents expected her to stop by their hotel around noon, but Janelle was running late. At first, they figured she might have gotten caught up with something, so they decided to go for a walk themselves. Before they left, they wrote her a note and stuck it in the door, but when they got back around 2:30 p.m., the note was still there. Realizing that Janelle hadn't come by as planned, her parents started to worry. They tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. It was strange. How could their daughter disappear on such a small island? The thought that something might have happened to her began to creep in. They went to her cottage and found the front door unlocked. But on Norfolk, that wasn't unusual. People rarely locked their doors, as crime was practically unheard of on the island. Inside, there was no sign of Janelle, and nothing suggested that anything bad had happened. Her car was also parked outside. While they were at the house, one of Janelle's friends showed up. When they told her they hadn't been able to reach Janelle all day, she suggested they check the route Janelle usually took for her daily walk. The three of them drove along the path, but there was no sign of her. After that, her parents returned to the hotel and informed the manager about what was going on. He made a few calls to people around the island, asking if anyone had seen Janelle, but no one had. By then, it was around 8 p.m., and her parents decided it was time to call the police. They explained that their daughter had been missing all day, and the officers asked them to come down to the station. The police informed Janelle's parents that, just an hour before their call, a tourist from New Zealand had discovered a body near a waterfall. She had spotted a large black bag and, upon getting closer, saw human hands sticking out from underneath it. When officers arrived at the scene, they found a woman's body, showing multiple visible injuries, and her clothes were partly missing. As Janelle's parents were speaking with the police, the officers had just begun processing the crime scene. They immediately suspected that the victim could be Janelle. To spare her parents from the trauma of identifying the body, the investigators asked Janelle's neighbor, the woman she rented the cottage from, to come to the scene. When she arrived, she immediately confirmed that the victim was indeed Janelle. The body was handed over to the medical examiners, but based on the initial assessment, it was clear that they were likely dealing with a murder. The news sent shockwaves through the island community. There hadn't been a murder on Norfolk since 1893, and even minor crimes were rare. The local police were used to handling nothing more serious than fights and domestic disputes, but now they were faced with a homicide investigation. Because of this, they decided to request assistance from Australian investigators, who immediately flew to the island. The medical examiners found 64 injuries on Janelle's body, including bruises and cuts likely caused by a sharp object, possibly broken glass. Supporting this theory, they found glass shards in her hair, which they believed came from a broken bottle. In addition to the cuts, there were bruises on her wrists, suggesting someone had held her down while she was being attacked. This led the investigators to consider that there may have been more than one person involved in the murder. Alongside the cuts from the glass, there were also stab wounds, indicating a knife had been used in the attack as well. Forensic experts found microscopic traces of green and white paint on Janelle's body. These particles were also present on her clothing and in her hair. The experts believe that the paint might have come from the perpetrator or their vehicle, possibly during the disposal of her body. Although part of Janelle's clothing was missing, which initially pointed to a possible sexual motive, the forensic team found no signs of sexual assault. However, they did recover a foreign DNA sample from her body, but it belonged to an unidentified female. The investigation was further complicated by the fact that around 3:30 p.m. on the day of the murder, a brief but intense rainstorm swept across the island. This downpour may have washed away crucial evidence, such as footprints, blood, or other biological samples. However, the rain did help establish a timeline. There were puddles in the black plastic sheet covering Janelle's body, indicating that it had been left there before the rain started. This meant that Janelle had likely been dead and lying there for at least 3 hours before she was discovered. While the forensic experts were busy searching for clues, the police began piecing together the final hours of Janelle's life. They discovered that after finishing her shift, Janelle stopped by a store before heading home. Around the same time, her landlord arrived and saw Janelle leaving for her usual walk. About 10 minutes later, another local resident drove past Janelle on the road. The next person to see her lived near the end of that route and spotted Janelle standing next to a white car talking to the driver. According to the witness, she thought there were 2 men in the car, but admitted it was possible there could have been only one. 5 minutes later, 2 more witnesses who lived close to the road reported hearing what sounded like a child crying in the distance. Another man said he heard a scream, but by the time he went outside to check, the noise had stopped. Based on this information, the police concluded that the attack on Janelle likely took place around 11:45 a.m., just half an hour after she had finished her shift. With no strong leads, the police sent the black plastic sheet that Janelle's body had been wrapped in to the mainland for more advanced testing. Sometime later, the results came back. Forensic experts had found 10 different fingerprints on the sheet, but all of them were partially smeared. Despite this, the detectives decided to try matching the prints. They compiled a list of everyone who had been on the island the day of the murder, which amounted to more than 2,700 names, including both locals and tourists. The police asked all individuals between the age of 15 and 70 to voluntarily provide fingerprints and DNA samples, but only half complied. Out of 1,300 sets of fingerprints, the experts couldn't find a single match. With no results from the prints, the investigators decided to shift their focus to potential suspects among Janelle's acquaintances. Her diary proved to be a key source of information. It contained detailed entries about life on the island and her relationships with its residents. From the diary, police learned that Janelle had a strained relationship with one of her friends. When Janelle first moved to the island, this woman helped her find a temporary place to live at her friend's house. However, Janelle didn't stay there long, apparently due to some disagreements. But even after Janelle moved out, this man continued to act suspiciously. Several witnesses reported that he had once threatened Janelle in the middle of the street. Police also discovered that after her body was found, he asked a friend to provide him with an alibi and say that they spent the day together, even though it wasn't true. The reason behind his behavior remained unclear, but the police uncovered an interesting detail. It appeared that he was in a secret relationship with Janelle's friend, the one who had helped her with housing, despite the fact that the woman was married with children. Janelle had written about their affair in her diary, and it was possible that the couple wasn't happy she knew about their secret. Despite this, both the man and the woman provided their fingerprints, and neither matched those found on the plastic sheet. The police also searched their homes and cars, but found no incriminating evidence. The next suspect the police looked into was a man Janelle had been dating for 9 months. He too was investigated for possible involvement, but once again, the police couldn't find any evidence linking him to the crime. Janelle's diary also mentioned several other people with whom she had tense relationships, but all of them agreed to provide their fingerprints and DNA samples, and none of them matched. At one point, the police even considered Janelle's parents as suspects, since the murder occurred the day after they arrived on the island, but this theory also led nowhere. Eventually, the investigation hit a dead end. For months, the police tried to identify new suspects and re-examine the existing evidence, but every lead turned into a dead end. They even announced a substantial reward of $300,000 for information about the case, but none of the tips brought them any closer to finding the killer. 2 years later, investigators reopened the case and decided to re-examine the fingerprint samples they had collected from locals and tourists. This time, they also included prints from suspects in other recent cases on the island. Since all the prints were stored on paper, experts had to compare them manually. The process took a while, but eventually detectives got a breakthrough call. The fingerprints of a suspect in another case matched 2 prints found on the black tarp used to wrap Janelle's body. That suspect was 26-year-old Glenn McNeil. Shortly after Janelle's murder, police had questioned him in connection with home invasion, but he wasn't arrested. Despite this, they had taken his fingerprints, which had been stored with the case file ever since. Police also learned that in 2002, McNeil owned a white Honda, matching the description of the car a witness saw near Janelle just minutes before her death. Another curious fact was that McNeil had left the island shortly after the murder. He had moved to Norfolk from New Zealand in 2000 with his wife and worked as a chef, but they later divorced, which also happened around the time of his move from the island. At the time of the investigation, McNeil was living in New Zealand with his new wife and 2 children, which made it difficult for the police to question him. However, they realized that he likely hadn't taken his car off the island, so they decided to search for it, hoping forensic experts could examine it for evidence. Before long, they found it. The white Honda had been abandoned on someone's property, not far from his old house, overgrown with weeds. It was handed over to forensics, and investigators got a warrant to search the house where McNeil had lived during his time on the island. When the experts thoroughly examined the car, they discovered traces of white and green paint that matched the paint particles found on Janelle's body. There were also a few glass shards, and similar fragments were found in his former home. An expert was called in to analyze the samples, and he confirmed that the glass shards from the car, the house, and the ones found on Janelle's clothes and body not only matched, but were produced at the same time for a specific type of product. He also discovered parts of an engraving on one of the shards, which turned out to be a name of a wine. This confirmed that all 3 sets of glass shards came from the same wine bottle. In the backyard of McNeil's former house, the police found a black tarp, exactly like the one used to wrap Janelle's body. They also discovered several human hairs and some biological traces in the trunk of his car, but unfortunately, both pieces of evidence had deteriorated over time, so the experts couldn't extract any DNA. Not giving up, detectives sent the hairs to a lab in the US, which had the most advanced technology at the time. But the process dragged on for a year. The first lab was overloaded and couldn't get to it right away. In the end, one of the detectives had to fly to the US to hand the samples to a different lab. Finally, in early 2006, the police got the result they were looking for. The hairs were confirmed to belong to Janelle. With all this evidence coming together, detectives secured an arrest warrant and headed to New Zealand to take McNeil into custody. He was then extradited to Australia, where he was officially charged with Janelle's murder. During the first interrogation, McNeil, to the surprise of the detectives, started confessing right away. He claimed that on the morning of the murder, he smoked some weed and went for a drive around the island. At some point, he bent down to grab a pack of cigarettes, lost sight of the road, and hit something. At first, McNeil thought he'd run over an animal, but when he got out of the car, he saw a person lying underneath it. Panicking, he loaded the body into his trunk and drove home, where he spent hours using drugs. A while later, he started hearing noises coming from the trunk and realized the woman was still alive. That's when he grabbed a kitchen knife, opened the trunk, and stabbed her multiple times. After that, McNeil wrapped the body in a tarp and dumped it near the waterfall. Despite his confession, detectives knew immediately he was lying. Almost everything he said didn't match the facts. Medical examiners were sure the injuries Janelle had didn't line up with being hit by a car. Plus, McNeil's story didn't explain the bruises on her wrist, the cuts from glass shards, and why part of her clothing had been removed. And if he really had stabbed her in the trunk, there would have been blood traces there, something the forensic team would never have missed. But there were none. The police tried to get him to tell the truth, pointing out all the inconsistencies, but McNeil stubbornly stuck to his version. In the end, the case went to trial, which began in the summer of 2006. It was held on the island, and the jury was selected from the local residents. At the first hearing, McNeil claimed he had nothing to do with the murder, and even said he didn't remember giving any confession to the police. He blamed his memory lapse on supposed mental health issues, although there was no medical proof to back up his claims. But by the time the trial began, the detectives had dug up something interesting. They knew McNeil's defense team would focus on the fact that female DNA was found on Janelle's body. It wasn't just on her clothes, it was also under her fingernails, which suggested she might have scratched a woman in a struggle before she died. This raised the possibility that a woman was involved in the murder and could have jeopardized the whole case. After McNeil's arrest, the investigators questioned everyone who knew Janelle, asking if there was any connection between her and McNeil. One of her friends remembered something odd. Just 2 or 3 weeks before Janelle's death, she had asked her friend if she knew a woman named Alicia and her husband, Glenn McNeil. The friend replied that she didn't know them personally, but had seen them around. Janelle didn't explain why she asked that and just changed the subject. This same friend also mentioned that on the day of the murder, she was working at a hotel and spotted Alicia outside acting weird. Alicia was covered in something red, and when the friend asked if everything was okay, Alicia, who seemed a bit shaken, simply said it was just paint and walked away. For some reason, the witness didn't think to tell the police about this at the time. She didn't realize it could be connected to Janelle's murder until detectives asked her about McNeil and his wife. Alicia was called to testify in court, but insisted she had nothing to do with the murder. We still don't know if the police compared her DNA with the female sample from Janelle's body. Interestingly, later on, Janelle's friend changed her testimony and claimed that a religious cult of 6 people was behind her murder. This revelation shocked investigators, casting doubt on all of her previous statements. As for McNeil, he continued to deny any involvement in the murder, still insisting he didn't remember confessing. But despite his claims, with all the evidence presented, the jury found him guilty. On March 9, 2007, he was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Even though the case seemed closed, many people continued to question whether McNeil was truly the killer. The most popular theory, based on witness statements and the nature of the injuries, suggested that he may not have acted alone. Either he killed Janelle with someone else or helped someone dispose of her body. A few years after the trial, McNeil suddenly claims he knew who really killed Janelle. According to his new story, it was a man who had been selling him drugs. McNeil said that on the morning of the murder, he was at home when this man and his wife showed up. The man told him there was a body in his trunk and ordered McNeil to get rid of it, threatening to harm him and his wife if he didn't comply. Scared for his life, McNeil did as he was told. He moved the body into his own car, wrapped it in a tarp, and took it to the waterfall. He also claimed he wore medical gloves while doing this, but the detectives quickly pointed out a flaw in his story. There were several of his fingerprints on the tarp, which wouldn't have been there if he had used gloves. Plus, he claimed he buried the gloves in his yard, but when police dug up the area, they didn't find anything. McNeil also named the man he claimed killed Janelle, and this guy was indeed suspected of selling illegal substances. When police checked McNeil's phone records, they found he had been in regular contact with him. However, this only suggested that McNeil was buying drugs from him, not that the man was involved in the murder. In the following years, several more theories about this case emerged, each one more dubious and contradictory than the last. Some media even suggested that Janelle was a secret police informant, claiming that could have been the real motive for her murder. But no solid evidence was ever found to support this theory, or any of the others. On February 1, 2024, McNeil was released from prison early and deported back to New Zealand. He will remain under supervision while on probation, but technically, he is now a free man. Throughout all these years, McNeil has stuck to his story that other people were responsible for the murder. Maybe one day, he'll change his story again, and we'll finally learn the truth. But until then, this case remains filled with unanswered questions. Melissa Wolfenbarger was born on September 9, 1977, in the small American town of Locust Grove, Georgia. She was the youngest child in her family, and her older sister, who was 7 years old when Melissa was born, helped their mom take care of her from day one. As they grew up, the sisters formed a really close bond. In high school, Melissa met a guy named Christopher, and soon after graduating, they got married. The couple settled in a quiet suburb of Atlanta, where Christopher landed a job at a glass manufacturing plant. Not long after moving, Melissa got pregnant and they welcomed a daughter, followed by a son a little later. By 1998, 21-year-old Melissa was spending most of her time at home, taking care of the kids. Even though she was quite young, she was happy with her growing family. Melissa also tried to visit her parents and sister as often as she could, but with the distance and all her responsibilities, those visits were rare. They planned to spend Christmas with her family that year, and a month before, on Thanksgiving, Melissa called her mom to ask for a special gift. She wanted some old photo of her grandfather. Her mother went through all the family albums, found the perfect photo, and began waiting for her daughter and the grandkids to arrive. But when Christmas came, Melissa didn't show up. At first, her parents were a bit surprised since they'd planned this for over a month, but they figured she might just be too busy. After all, she had 2 small kids to care for, and she'd also recently started working at a cafe because Christopher's income wasn't enough to support the whole family. The situation was complicated by the fact that they couldn't just call Melissa and ask why she didn't come. There was no phone in her house, and back then, cell phones weren't common. Melissa usually called them from her in-laws' house, but since her last call on Thanksgiving, she hadn't reached out once. Her parents decided to wait, but when Melissa didn't call on her mother's birthday, they started to worry something might be wrong. That's when they decided to head to Atlanta to check on her. However, they were met with a surprising discovery. Melissa and Christopher's house was completely empty. After speaking with the neighbors, they learned that the family had moved out right after Christmas, but no one knew where they had gone. This only made her parents more confused. They couldn't imagine that Melissa just moved somewhere else without telling them. Eventually, they got in touch with Christopher's parents, and through them, finally reached Christopher himself. But the whole situation became even more puzzling. He claimed Melissa had left him back in December, and he hadn't seen her since. According to him, she had decided to move to California and start a new life, leaving him and their kids behind. Her parents found Christopher's story hard to believe. First off, they couldn't imagine Melissa abandoning her kids, who were only 1 and 2 years old. Plus, if she had really decided to move, they were sure she would have reached out or visited at some point, but that never happened. Despite their doubts, Christopher stuck to his story, and Melissa's parents couldn't get any more information out of him. They returned home, unsure of what to do next, but determined to find their daughter. Over the next few months, they tried to track her down, reaching out to friends and relatives, but it was as if Melissa had vanished into thin air. In the spring of 1999, Melissa's mother saw a news report about Atlanta police finding a human head in a bag, soaked in bleach, in a wooded area. A few days later, they discovered 4 more bags containing other body parts. What immediately caught her attention was that the site was near Christopher's old job, and she feared the remains could belong to her daughter. However, the police later said that the head belonged to a missing man from another cold case. By early 2000, her parents finally decided to involve the police, but it didn't help much. Investigators spoke with Christopher and concluded that Melissa had likely left her family to start a new life, which is why she hadn't reached out. As a result, the police didn't pursue the case, but Melissa's parents refused to believe that she had just walked away from her old life. In fact, with each passing month, they became more convinced that something bad had happened to her, and they suspected Christopher was involved. Her parents knew the couple had been having serious problems. Christopher had physically abused Melissa several times, leading her to leave him and stay with her parents, bringing the kids along. But every time, he'd apologize and talk her into coming back. This fact only made Christopher's story more suspicious. If he had done everything he could to get her back in the past, why hadn't he done anything this time? He didn't call her parents, didn't go to the police, and made no effort to stop her from leaving. Another odd detail was that, according to Christopher, Melissa hadn't taken anything with her. No clothes, no jewelry, not even her documents. It all seemed incredibly strange, but without help from the police, Melissa's parents felt powerless to do anything about it. For the next few years, there was still no sign of Melissa, but in 2003, everything changed, and in the most shocking way. Police were investigating the murder of a woman from back in 1977. The case had been cold for 26 years, but it was recently reopened. After reviewing the evidence and running a DNA test, detectives identified the killer. It was Carl Patton, Melissa's father. But that was just the beginning. Once police arrested him, Carl offered them a deal. He agreed to confess to 3 more murders in exchange for full immunity for his wife, who had helped him with the killings. As part of the deal, Melissa's mother also agreed to testify against her husband, and eventually she was granted immunity. According to their confessions, in December 1977, a woman named Mary, who was close to Carl, offered him $15,000 to kill her husband. The reason? Her husband had been cheating on her. Plus, Mary had taken out a life insurance on him and wanted to cash in. Carl agreed and brought in a friend to help carry out the murder. However, when they approached the man, his lover was with him, so they decided to kill her too. They dumped the woman's body in a river and left the man's body in his car on train tracks, hoping to make it look like an accident. A month later, Carl told his wife that his partner had apparently blabbed about the crime to his girlfriend, and now he wanted to take care of them too. Carl invited the couple to his home, killed them, and with his wife's help, disposed of the bodies by throwing them into a river. She also helped him clean the crime scene and the van they had used to transport the bodies. Later, Carl confessed to a 5th murder that took place 5 years before the others. It was again Mary who had offered him money, this time to kill her first husband, and Carl agreed. As a result, Carl was charged with 5 murders, and the police immediately suspected him in Melissa's disappearance. But Carl insisted he would never harm his daughter and had nothing to do with it. Upon further investigation, detectives concluded that Carl was probably telling the truth. Initially, they had only suspected him of 1 murder, but he voluntarily confessed to 4 more. Carl claimed he deeply regretted his actions, and it was this remorse that drove him to confess. But that wasn't all. Seizing the moment, Carl decided to ask for a favor. He requested a meeting with the lead detective who had tied him to the murder and said, "You managed to catch me, so maybe you can find my daughter." The detective was intrigued by the whole situation. Here was a man who had committed 5 murders, now asking him to investigate his daughter's disappearance. It was an unusual situation, to put it lightly, and the detective agreed to look into it. He began reviewing the limited information about Melissa's disappearance and quickly noticed one specific detail: those bags of human remains found near Christopher's workplace 4 years earlier. At the time, police had assumed the remains belonged to a man, but the detective discovered that this assumption wasn't based on forensic evidence, just a guess. Given the fact that the remains were found in an advanced state of decomposition, he decided to have them re-examined and ordered a DNA test, as he already had Carl's DNA on file. The results confirmed his suspicion. The remains didn't belong to a man. They belonged to Melissa. After this breakthrough, police finally established that Melissa had been dead for several years, not missing, and her case was officially reclassified as a homicide. According to the medical examiner's report, the victim's body had been dismembered using a reciprocating electric saw. Melissa's torso was never found, which was quite odd. The police conducted multiple searches in the wooded area where the other remains were found, but still couldn't locate it. Despite this, investigators uncovered one interesting lead. They began looking deeper into Christopher and interviewed his former employer at the glass factory where he had worked until Melissa's disappearance. It turned out that Christopher had been fired around the same time for allegedly stealing an electric saw of the same type used to dismember Melissa's body. Melissa's mother also revealed to the police that Christopher had a history of physically abusing her daughter. On top of that, he had a criminal record. Another suspicious detail was that Christopher had changed his name almost immediately after Melissa's death, with no clear reason for doing so. All of this made Christopher the prime suspect in her murder, but the police had no hard evidence against him. They interviewed him multiple times, but he stuck to his original story, although he frequently changed certain details. During one conversation, Christopher claimed Melissa had a lover and ran away with him. Later, he stated that she wanted to sell fake IDs, which explained why she hadn't contacted anyone. The police also uncovered another interesting fact. Shortly after moving from their house, Christopher left his children to live with his parents and hardly ever played a role in their lives since then. He visited them sometimes, but the children didn't even understand that he was their father. But unfortunately, none of this brought the investigators closer to an arrest because they needed some solid evidence. They obtained a warrant to search the house where Melissa had lived at the time of her death. Given that the killer had used an electric saw, detectives believed the murder likely took place in that house, and they hoped to find blood traces or other evidence. Forensic experts meticulously examined every inch of the house, taking samples from the floor and other surfaces. Unfortunately, their analysis yielded no results. The forensic technology of the time was far less advanced than it is today, leaving the detectives with no choice but to store the collected materials in the evidence warehouse, hoping that one day they might prove useful. The detectives made several more attempts to find new leads and get Christopher to talk, but each effort came up empty. The case eventually went cold again for many years. Meanwhile, Melissa's father was convicted and sentenced to 5 life terms plus 20 years in prison. It's worth noting that Mary, the woman who had paid him for 2 of the murders, had passed away in the late 80s, so she never faced any punishment for her role. Melissa's mother and her older sister continued trying to push the investigation forward on their own. They worked to keep the case in the media spotlight and stayed in regular contact with the detectives, but their efforts didn't yield any progress. This continued until 2017, and Melissa's mother never gave up hope of finding justice for her daughter. That year, she decided to attend an event where true crime enthusiasts gathered to discuss cold cases and search for new leads. One of the attendees was a crime analyst named Cheryl McCullum, and Melissa's mother decided to ask her for help. She shared the story of her daughter's disappearance and added something that immediately caught Cheryl off guard. The woman said, "My husband committed 5 murders, and I helped him." Cheryl became intrigued by the case, and after the event, she began to dig into it thoroughly. She spoke with Melissa's family and even kept in contact with her father, who was serving time in prison. What struck Cheryl the most was how a man who had committed 5 murders seemed more concerned that his daughter's murder would never be solved. Over the next few years, Cheryl collected all the available information on the case and came to the conclusion that the most obvious suspect was Melissa's husband, Christopher. Although there was no direct evidence against him, the overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence left little doubt. He had a history of domestic violence against Melissa, made no effort to find her after she disappeared, and simply moved on with his life as if nothing had happened. But the most incriminating detail was the fact that, shortly before Melissa's death, Christopher had been accused by his employer of stealing the exact type of saw used to dismember her body. No one in Melissa's family doubted Christopher's guilt, including her children. By the time Cheryl became interested in the case, they had grown up and also tried to help her solve it. Cheryl also consulted some prominent figures in the true crime community, including journalist Nancy Grace and several law enforcement officials. After reviewing all the material she had gathered, they all agreed Christopher was the most likely suspect. Despite this, there wasn't a single undeniable piece of evidence against him, and the case remained at a standstill. At that point, Nancy Grace suggested that Cheryl start her own podcast to draw more attention to the case. Publicity can often become a crucial factor in unsolved cases. It might attract new witnesses who might not realize the significance of the information they hold, potentially changing the course of the investigation. Eventually, Cheryl decided to launch the podcast, and in 2023, she released the first episode about Melissa's case. Since then, she has recorded numerous episodes featuring the victim's mother and other relatives. Cheryl presented all the information she had gathered over the years, yet there was still no progress in the case. This continued until April 2024, when the long-awaited breakthrough in the case finally happened. After she published another episode, a witness reached out to Cheryl, stating that he had stumbled upon the podcast and might have valuable information. This individual shared that just before Melissa's disappearance, he witnessed a serious argument between her and Christopher. The details of his account remain unknown, as it all took place only a few months prior, and detectives chose not to disclose this information for the sake of the investigation. According to some sources, it seems that during this argument, Christopher allegedly threatened Melissa, and Cheryl passed his story on to the police. This became a turning point, prompting investigators to reopen the case. Over the next 3 months, police reviewed the case materials, interviewed everyone involved, and examined the evidence using modern technology. Experts analyzed the bags containing the remains, along with various samples from Christopher and Melissa's home, where the murder apparently took place. In August 2024, investigators held a press conference to announce that, 25 years after Melissa's death, her husband had finally been arrested. As with the witness testimony, police did not disclose specific details about the evidence they discovered during the renewed investigation. Some sources suggest that modern analysis tools may have uncovered DNA traces or other substantial evidence confirming Christopher's involvement in the murder. The reason detectives are withholding details is fairly standard. The more information is available before the trial, the greater the chances that the defense can use it to their advantage and find ways to challenge the evidence. Currently, Christopher is in jail awaiting trial, and a preliminary hearing where he will plead either guilty or not guilty has yet to take place. Melissa's relatives have little doubt that he will evade justice, and neither do the investigators. It seems they have indeed uncovered serious evidence that will be extremely difficult to dispute. At this moment, the case is drawing closer to its conclusion, though it has taken nearly 26 years. Melissa's story has spread across the country as its details are truly astonishing. Initially, police were able to confirm that the victim was no longer alive only because her father had been arrested for 5 murders and asked investigators for help. Then, the podcast played a crucial role in attracting the witness whose testimony led to the reopening of the investigation and ultimately Christopher's arrest. As for Melissa's children, they also believe in their father's guilt and hope that justice will prevail soon. Besides waiting for a guilty verdict, they want to learn the full truth and Christopher's motives, but that will only be possible if he confesses. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.